Well, thank you so much for joining us today as we begin our second annual celebration of the Vincentian Charism in Action. Thanks to Rihanna for organising this week of online gatherings, and particularly to those joining from further afield. We're delighted to welcome our sisters from Australia, a proud community of our Rosalie Rondeau province. Before we begin this morning, we have a message from Mark McGreevy. I'm sure you all know Mark very well, having taken the work of homelessness charity DePaul International from its roots locally to about 5 or 6 different countries now. Mark serves as the president of the International DePaul Group, was a founder of the Institute for Global Homelessness, and serves in leading the response of the Vincentian family through the Vincentian Homeless Alliance. And Mark's got this message for us before we begin.
It's the one about the Franca. Yeah, I think I missed that one. Keep going. Okay.
Hi everyone, I'm delighted to welcome you to Vincentian Values Week 2022, now in its second year. This week is a chance to reflect, celebrate and deepen the Vincentian charism that has inspired thousands of people to offer a caring and compassionate service to those in need over the past 400 years. This year the theme is Crisis to Crisis, which recognises the immense challenges faced by the poorest and most vulnerable in our communities over the past few years. From the COVID-19 pandemic to the war in Ukraine and now to the cost of living crisis, Vincentian organisations have and continue to respond with generosity and creativity, trying to make sure that no one is left behind. During the course of the week, you will have opportunity to hear from various members of the Vincentian family who will share remarkable stories of how Vincentians have come together, adapted and responded to the needs of people in times of emergency and difficulty. We'll hear from the Daughters of Charity's representative to the United Nations about the work taking place there, both in crisis response and in long-term development goals. We'll hear about the work of DePaul International in Ukraine, supporting the 17 million displaced by the ongoing war. We'll also be hearing from the work of the Daughters of Charity in Australia and how they sought to support people experiencing homelessness through the COVID-19 pandemic. And we'll learn of the challenges being experienced in London today by families facing the toughest winter of their lives in the midst of rising inflation, high costs of energy, and a cost of living crisis. Throughout the week, we'll return to our key theme of how our shared values help shape our Vincentian response to such a range of challenges, and how these values provide the hope that we can make a difference which people so sorely need at this time. These inspiring sessions will not only guide us on how we deliver a truly Vincentian service, but also encourage each and every one of us to become advocates for social justice. As Vincent de Paul once said, there is no act of charity that is not accompanied by justice or that permits us to do more than we reasonably can. We look forward to seeing you through the week, and thank you for all you give to the service of the poor.
As Mark highlights, this week we're joined by a number of fantastic speakers. Our theme this week is Crisis to Crisis, in recognition of the extraordinary work taking place throughout the Vincentian family with people and communities in need around the world. Today, we find ourselves facing significant challenges. Whilst it feels like we're only just beginning to recover and rebuild from the COVID pandemic, we now find ourselves faced with runaway inflation, a cost of living crisis, and what appears to be a looming recession. Here in the UK, we've just seen a fairly extraordinary emergency budget announced, declaring a commitment to prioritising the freedom of the richest to increase their share of the wealth at the expense of the poorest in society. You'll have to work harder for longer in an effort just to keep on top of rising bills. Such circumstances highlight one of the core principles of Catholic social teaching, that of the preferential option for the poor, and it serves as a prompt to redouble our efforts to help serve those in need, and also to seek to change the systems which seem designed to keep the poor excluded and marginalised. The scale of the challenges we now face, to a certain extent, recalls the range of challenges faced by St. Vincent de Paul and St. Louise de Marillac, as they dedicated themselves to serving Christ in the poor, inspired by the clear instructions set forth in Matthew 25. 17th century France saw no shortage of crises, with St. Vincent and St. Louise seeking to serve those suffering from the consequences of war, gross inequality, galley slavery, sickness, and familial abandonment. The consistency of the response, that care was to be provided with dignity, respect, and above all with love, provides the solid foundation of our Vincentian movement. Today, we are privileged to be joined by the Daughters of Charity's representative to the United Nations in Geneva, Sister Franca Oqua. Before joining the UN, Sister Franca served as provincial to the province of Nigeria for almost a decade, during which she oversaw the opening of new missions in Ghana and Burkina Faso. Sister Franca has also served as a senior lecturer at the Institute of Formators, established by the Nigeria Conference of Women Religious for the formation of those entering religious life. In spring this year, Sister Franca took up her role in Geneva as the representative of the Daughters of Charity to the United Nations, seeking to ensure that the most critical issues faced by some of the poorest and most marginalized amongst us are raised at the very highest level, a truly Vincentian act of advocacy. Today, she lends us her time to share her experience and her insight of this work. Sister Franca, thank you so much for joining us this morning. The floor is now yours.
Thank you, Mark, for the introduction. And I wish to say a good day to all our sisters from Australia and from here in the United Kingdom. I wish to say good day to all our collaborators who have joined us and who actually have planned this week of reflection on our Vincentian values and how we are using it to respond to the crisis of the world around us. So I'm going to share with you some information about my work experience with the United Nations in Geneva. And I must tell you that what I'm going to share is only an iceberg of all that is happening in that mission, because the institution of the United Nations is a very enormous one, and sometimes with overwhelming challenges. Governments and households across the world face immense pressure as unsparing inflation pushes millions into poverty. The United Nations, in her global engagements throughout the world, use the many relevant instruments and mechanisms to gather information, to make investigations, to monitor and evaluate, and also to organize global debates that seeks to provide appropriate intervention and response to the world's crisis. Next slide, please, Rihanna. In her document titled Shaping Renewed Multilateral Relationship, the Undersecretary General and Director of the United Nations Office at Geneva states that in the light of the many interrelated challenges the world faces, from humanitarian crisis to economic shocks, and from climate change to pandemics, international cooperation is needed now more than ever. Such international cooperation is achieved through the efforts of the United Nations in Geneva, New York, or in Vienna to pool resources together to respond to the needs of the globe as the situation arises. Many people do not understand the structure or process from which the UN operates. And I must tell you, that is not a strange place to be. Until I encountered the procedure of the United Nations Organization from August 2021, I could not imagine what such an enormous institution is about. Even now, after 1 year of being appointed to the office, I still feel like a beginner and must acknowledge that I have a long way to go to integrate and absorb the enormity and sometimes overwhelming complexity of the mission in the United Nations and its functional mechanisms. However, I have the conviction that with time, I shall get to know it better and integrate with a greater sense of confidence. Next slide, please. The good news for me is that I am working in a very good and conducive environment, whereupon are several other religious congregations who are all linking up and serving as non-governmental organizations or Catholic-inspired institutions at the United Nations, all of which are determined to share the gifts of their charisms with the United Nations and through it to reach out to the world. As you can see on the slide, I work in the office with the Franciscan International, the Dominicans for Justice, Edmond Rise International, Maris Priests and Brothers, the Vivat Group, the Good Shepherd Sisters, and ourselves, the Daughters of Charity. There are many other organizations that are not actually in this office, spread all over Geneva and institutions. The United Nations, in their constant gatherings and reflections, are aware that the world is in crisis and therefore need urgent intervention to bring about some respite and hope for the people of the world. The Undersecretary General, as stated at the beginning of this document, rightly observed that multilateral relationship is on fire, and the time to put that fire down is now. The member states recognize this during the 75th anniversary of the United Nations and came up with the call for the reinvigoration of multilateral relationship. Slide number 4, please. How does the UN operate? They use international law to refer to all legally binding rules that apply at international level. Such laws concern the way in which member states behave towards each other and holds the primary regulatory function for the purpose of facilitating international cooperation and giving it a predictable pattern on the basis of being binding rules. Whereas the main objectives of the international law are to create the conditions for international peace and stability. Consequently, relations in the framework of international law have acquired greater importance as a result of increasing globalization and have also become more complex since most of the problems which individual states face today cannot easily be solved at the international level. The modern international law is of growing relevance in areas that were once the exclusive domain of international law. The impact of COVID-19. The COVID-19 pandemic has taken a lot of blame for the global crisis as a result of its unforgiving nature, the number of deaths recorded throughout the world, through its lack of cure, through the drastic nature that it inhabited at the onset in late 2019, through the unfair distribution of the vaccine or the lack of preparedness of the whole world for its advent. Before the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, the whole world was unconsciously marching into the crisis of food insecurity. Slide 5, please. Inflation, climate change, and high costs of energy. Many parts of the world were experiencing high levels of insecurity and threats to human life through political instability, terrorism, kidnapping, and attacks to churches and its ministers. Suicide bombing, online grooming for jihadist action, human trafficking, and trafficking in body parts as a quick way to get rich. Human migration, internal displacement of people, criminal acts among the young, dangerous trips and voyages by foot across the desert, by boat across the Mediterranean Sea and European channels, in flight from wars and human rights suppression. So on the slides, you see that we try to gather a few pictures of the scenario that I'm trying to describe here. On top of all this, women and children were disproportionately affected as a result of gender-specific restrictions and violation. Nevertheless, though most parts of the world were badly affected. Other parts lived in complacency on the power of their digital and technological advancements, almost shielded from the desperate circumstances that were looming around the world. Unfortunately, in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic, things were different. The pandemic brought us all to our knees. The high and the mighty, the weak and the strong, the rich and the poor, the young and the old, all fell victims to the wicked pandemic, making all of us vulnerable in the world that needed to be cleansed and to be healed at the same time. Even healthcare workers who were bound by the ethics of their profession lost their lives and were completely overwhelmed and helpless with the threat of a merciless pandemic. Thank God for scientists who persevered in their researches and discovery of vaccine that came to quell the fears and offered reassurance to those who were courageous enough to accept the vaccines. This could not have been possible without multilateral cooperation among nations and academia. Next slide, please. The use of international law as a tool for crisis response. The provision of the international law apply in a wide range of areas, as illustrated by the following points. Prohibition of the use of force. In this case, it requires that states settle their disputes by peaceful means. Human rights and advocacy. Every individual may claim certain fundamental rights, for example, the right to life, physical integrity, individual freedom, freedom of opinion, and the freedom of conscience. Protection of persons in armed conflicts. International humanitarian law contains rules that apply in times of armed conflicts, particularly for the protection of civilians, the wounded, and the prisoners of war. The fight against terrorism and other serious crimes. This can only be prosecuted effectively through international cooperation and multilateral relationship. The declaration for the protection of the climate and conservation of natural resources can be more effective only when universally applied. In this situation, we see enormous amount of inequality, because in as much as we live in a developed part of the world where beautiful spaces are preserved, in other parts of the world, those beautiful places are actually raped and destroyed most of the time by the multinationals themselves. Trade and development. Most countries earn half of their income abroad, and this is as a result of the existence of a functioning and stable international environment. telecommunication international regulations has made it possible to access telephone and media communication all around the world, even in the most interior parts of the world. Transport. International treaties are there to ensure and monitor that passengers arrive safely to their destinations, be it by air, by land, or by sea. International law. Each state is sovereign and equal under the law, whether they are big or small, rich or poor. In this case, international organizations such as the United Nations have played an increasingly important role in the past few decades. They were created by the international communities to respond to specific needs that are beyond the power of individual states. The United Nations employ and assign independent experts, special reporters, and undersecretaries to carry out visits for country reviews. Scheduled visits are published in the United Nations website for information, for accountability, for stewardship, and transparency. They collaborate with non-governmental organizations, faith-based otherwise, to carry out their functions. The NGOs, human rights activists, and the civil societies collaborate with each other, bringing their goals and specific objectives to draw synergy for tackling of the world's crisis. The United Nations conversation and observations among country representatives. During a recent meeting with the United Nations Special Reporter for the Rights to Development of All People in July 2022, the following observations were strongly articulated as grouped under 3 different headings. The first heading is under the framework of predictions. And so the United Nations in that meeting predicted that there is need to ask the right people the right questions. The need to think through the long-term effects and the consequences of the plans that UN makes with regards to its crisis intervention. There is need for the formation of the young towards the use of rights-based approach to life for a sustainable future. There is need to create the roadmap on the right direction to go. There is need to think of the future summits that will build a sustainable society. Create good communication that is inclusive, and how to learn the lesson of our global shock, because as far as meeting the needs of the poor is concerned, it is impossible to do so without the poor themselves. And this is an important aspect for the presence of the Daughters of Charity, the Vincentian family at the United Nations. We are there constantly trying to draw the attention of the United Nations during debates to the sufferings and the struggles of those who are poor. We are also there to ensure that what we hear from the grassroots of the services carried out by the different branches of the Vincentian families, that we are able to filter those information back into the debate table. To reimagine education for the 21st century and what that will mean for the young people. That youth office should be created at the UN and to explore how they will help to create the future that will be sustainable. To involve children as stakeholders for creating a future agenda that is inclusive and intergenerational. Challenges. In the challenges, they noted that there is loss of trust within and across nations, that too many people have fallen back into extreme poverty, that the United Nations is in every corner of the world and sits on a large collection of data with regards to human sufferings and struggles. That all attention is currently on the war between Russia and Ukraine at the expense of other crises. That there are dangerous fragmentations among the nations and its negative impacts on the values of the UN and its work. Homicides and gender violence around the world, especially against women, against children, and against vulnerable adults. The questions are, what will the climate look like if we do not change our behavior? How do we go about the fact that only happy people can breed a happy world? And why should we use multilateral partnership to strengthen equality around the world? United Nations efforts for crisis response. In September 2015, at the United Nations General Assembly, governments of the world committed themselves to a transformative 2030 agenda for sustainable development. Next slide, please. We see this 17 list of agenda as keying in very practically with we have tried to embed it all, the 17 development goals. We have embedded it into the phrase Vincentian value. After years of negotiation, it was agreed that all nations would individually and collectively work to achieve 17 Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. Each goal came with a series of measurable targets. Such targets included phrases like end poverty and hunger, reduce inequality within nations and between nations, provide decent work and quality education for all, and to combat climate change. These targets are as politically challenging for countries like the United States of America, Europe, Australia, and for countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. The massive process of consultation and negotiation to define the goals involves not only by government, but every sector of human community. Nothing like this has ever happened before. The goals concern all of us. They have the potential to become a focus for the forces of good actions in all sectors of society, and could be the vehicle to inspire waves of activity in every society and every country. The goals can only be reached by 2030 if people everywhere are inspired to contribute towards their achievements, locally, nationally, and worldwide. Therefore, every one of us needs to know about the goal. There is no doubt that the war in different parts of the world and the alarming shortage of food and other essential commodities has impacted dangerously and negatively on the timeline 2030. We hear in the midst of these goals that the UN and the whole world wants to work for the fact that no one should be left behind. This statement is quite an ambitious one when it is thrown to us as a Vincentian family, because this is where we truly come in our identification of those who are left behind, and try our best to ensure that they are included, they are empowered, and they are led into a way of transformation. Over the years, since 2017, the United Nations has provided food and assistance to over 80 million people in over 80 countries, supplied vaccines to over 45% of world's children, thereby saving over 3 million lives a year, assisted and protected over 65.3 million people fleeing war, famine, and persecution around the world. They have worked with over 195 nations to hold the rise in global temperature below 2 degrees. They've kept peace with over 117,000 peacekeepers in over 16 operations in 4 continents of the world. They fight poverty, helping to improve the lives of more than 1.1 billion people around the world. They protect and promote human rights globally with more than 80 treaties and declarations. They have coordinated $22.5 billion appeal for the humanitarian needs of more than 93.5 million people around the world. They have used diplomacy to prevent conflicts and assist over 67 countries per year with their election. They have supported maternal health, helping over 1 million women a month to overcome pregnancy risks. The issue of pregnancy risk is you can only become face-to-face with it when you live in developing countries and see how mothers are dying in the process of bringing a child to the world, just because they are not in the right place to receive the right support and attention. Slide number 7. How does our Vincentian value inspire us to cope with the crisis around us? Going back to the drawing board, we have to constantly remind ourselves that Vincent de Paul and Louise de Marillac were no strangers to the world's crisis. It was the crisis of the French Revolution in the 17th century that inspired the establishment of the Company of the Daughters of Charity and the ethos of the Vincentian family, which has now lasted for over 400 years. Vincent tells us that love is creative to infinity, and that love must be inventive with the work of our hands and the sweat of our brows. Therefore, as we serve the poor with kindness, integrity, compassion, humor, and fairness, we must learn to do that with intuitive courage and be selfless in engaging in services and ministries that will positively impact the lives of those who are suffering. Vincent knew he could not do it on his own. Therefore, he reached out in collaboration, team spirit, cooperation, inclusiveness, risk-taking, detachment, and determination. What would Vincent ask us to add to the list of our Vincentian values today as we negotiate the crisis of our world? I imagine that he will ask us to be resilient, interactive, dialogue with those who are poor, to engage them in what concerns them, and to do so with integrity, approachability, proactive, and constancy. He will ask us to remember that Jesus came that we may have life and have it to the full. Having all of you as part of this global Vincentian family is a plus that can never be taken for granted. And with all hands on deck, we shall all continue to do whatever we can to supplement, subsidize, and enrich the different efforts from governments and all like-minded obstacles that confronts us today, and to do so with untarnished fidelity, extravagant loving, caring, and forgiving, so that the world might be transformed for the better. Some of us viewing this presentation today may not be in our time to witness a full change of response in the crisis of the world. But the fact is that whatever we do today, we have to be reassured that we have planted a seed that will lead to the transformation of the world for the future generation that will come after us, and for the civilization of love that we talk about each time. Thank you, and God bless you all for listening.
Thank you ever so much, Sister Franca. That was an incredible way to kick off Vincentian Values Week. So yes, an inspiring, very inspiring speech. So yeah, on behalf of everyone here, yeah, we really thank you for that. We've got a couple of minutes for questions. So if anyone has anything that they would like to ask Sister Franca, either from today's session or about her work at the UN or processes there, please feel free to wave your hand or put a virtual hand up if you can. Let's see if anyone's got any questions. Do we have someone?
Hello, can you hear?
Yes, we can hear.
Yes, Sister Sarah.
Hello. Franca, you've made an amazing impression and shown how important the Vincentian movement and the group you work with are playing to present the voice of the poor. Can you say a bit more in practical terms, how often does your group meet and how do they go about presenting the needs of the poor to the delegates of a particular meeting of any assembly? How does it get to them and how are they convinced that there's something has to be done? If you can say anything, that would be lovely. Thank you.
Yes, Sister. Thank you very much, Sister, for your question. A very good one too. Yes, the group, let me say, the Catholic inspired institutions, we meet once a month to discuss issues that come up around the world. As I say, some information are published in the website of the United Nations. So every time we have to log into the website, see what the program is, which country is on review, who is visiting which country of the world, and what is the topic of debate that they are bringing forth. So when we look at it and find what is there, any member of the Catholic inspired group can pick up a particular topic. For instance, development, the right to development of all people. So any member can pick that up and propose a statement. This statement will be sent around to all of us. We will all read it and agree, and we can co-sign it so that just not one person is carrying the label of the signature, because it's a very sensitive work, and sometimes the things you say can be used by the countries against you. So we shield ourselves under the group. And then when we have put a statement together, a meeting comes up at the United Nations office. Dates are given. We make sure that we log in and sign ourselves into that meeting, and we attend that meeting. The purpose for attending that meeting is to be able to participate practically on grounds when the debate's going on. If there's something we disagree with, we present it in our statement. Sometimes United Nations spend so much time arguing, just discussing, and not bringing resolutions to bear. So we try to put pressure on them through advocacy, through lobbying. Sometimes we make visits to the ambassadors of those different countries that are on discussion to negotiate. So this is one of the ways that we do our work as groups, and we try to support it that way. Sometimes we also organize what they call side events. And these side events may be presented within the United Nations buildings. There are small offices where we have those meetings. Or we just put it out in front of United Nations arena and keep it open to the public for public awareness creating, for getting them to come and see what is happening around and to maybe get information from the grassroots and feed it in so that we can take it to the table of discussion. That's one way that we do it. Thank you.
Very many thanks. It was wonderful. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Margot has a question.
Thank you.
Yes.
Oh, thank you, Rihanna. Good morning, Sister Franca, and
Morning.
thank you for that very interesting presentation. Near the end of the presentation, you talked about the view and the approach of St. Vincent, and one of the words that you used to describe him was detachment.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if you could expand on that, and in what way would he have been detached from, you know, the issues that he was involved in? What did you mean?
You know, what do I mean by that?
Mm-hmm.
Vincent de Paul was a man that had the capacity to integrate and relate very much with the rich and the poor. And he was exposed to, you know, having anything around him because of the rich people that he was helping, and they were able to support him with his work. But none of those things, the riches, the wealth that he came across, you know, did not inhibit his attention. He knew whatever he got was for the good of the poor. And so he detached himself, you know, from what will I say, the wealth around him that he would have seen. He was so detached because he knew those things were not for him. In other words, I'm saying that, you know, whatever comes our way, because we are serving the poor, that we should have that sense and grace of detachment in order to be able to use these goods for what is meant for, to better the lives of the poor. I wonder, have I made any sense in that response? Anybody can participate in this conversation. Thank you.
No, thank you. I understand what you mean now by he was really detached very much from the world.
Yes.
You know, it was not I that lived, but Christ that lived in me. That's essentially the model of Vincent. So no, I understand. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you, Margaret.
Do we have any other questions before we wrap up today? I'm sure if you think of something in the next day or two, if you email us, we can send them over to Sister Franca. Thank you all so much for joining today. Before we finish, Sister Franca has got a video to share for a couple of minutes. So if you do have a few spare moments to stay on for that, that would be wonderful. And once again, Sister Franca, thank you so much for today. It really has been so inspiring, and we really appreciate your time and sharing all that you do at the UN and how it works to serve people who need us most. So
thank you, Rihanna. Thank you.
So and we do have, if you'd like to join us again tomorrow, it is a feast day of St. Vincent de Paul, a very special day. So if you'd like to join us again at the same time, 10 o'clock, we have a Vincentian reflection. Thank you all.
People say that we'll never live in peace. It's written on the walls that tell us we are enemies, but I see it differently, so differently. Yeah, I believe we are all one family, all people, different faces of the same humanity, and we can choose the way of peace, the way of peace. We're gonna rise up, rise up. We're a million different colors dancing to the beat. where freedom and respect will walk together hand in hand, 'cause we choose the way of peace, the way of peace. We're gonna rise up, rise up. We're a million different colors dancing to the beat. Rise up, rise up. We're a million voices singing as one. We choose peace. Hey, we choose peace. We choose peace.
Yo creo en la paz, yo creo en la paz, yo creo en la paz, yo creo en la paz. Io vivo per la pace, io vivo per la pace, io vivo per la pace, io vivo per la pace. Acredito na paz, acredito na paz. 我选择和平，我选择和平。Я выбираю мир, я выбираю мир. أنا بخاف الشلون، أنا بخاف الشلون. نتشكوى أمان، نتشكوى أمان.